Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a fascinating plunge into a legal concept that, well, without you even realizing it, fundamentally shapes so many of the interactions we have every single day. We're talking about agency law. If you're looking to truly master these crucial building blocks in the legal landscape, maybe you're trying to understand how businesses operate, or, and I know this is key for many of you, you're gearing up for a major challenge like the bar exam, then trust me, you are in the absolute right place. Our mission with this deep dive is, well, it's to give you that ultimate shortcut to understanding. We're extracting the most important nuggets of knowledge from our source material so you can walk away feeling not just informed, but truly insightful.
That's absolutely right. And for anyone looking to build a really solid legal foundation, agency principles are incredibly pervasive. I mean, everywhere. They don't just live in dense legal textbooks. They're kind of the invisible threads connecting everything from, simple errands to complex corporate structures. They influence every business interaction, every partnership, every corporation, and even a lot of tort claims. Think of it as the foundational language of how one person can act on behalf of another. Our mission for this deep dive, specifically for you listening, is to break down every single aspect of agency law. We're assuming you know nothing about it. Zero. We're building this from the ground up, making sure you get a comprehensive understanding. Perfect for tackling those tricky bar exam questions, honestly, and giving you a real-world edge.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting right at the very beginning. When we talk about agency, what exactly is that relationship? What are we fundamentally defining here?
Okay. So, at its most fundamental, agency describes the legal consequences when one person, we call them the agent, acts on behalf of someone else.
And is subject to their control, right?
And critically, yes, is subject to the control of that other person who we call the principal.
Mm.
Imagine it like this. The agent is effectively stepping into the shoes of the principal.
Okay.
And their actions can legally bind the principal. It's really about delegation of power, but, with very specific legal guardrails.
And this isn't just some obscure corner of law, is it? You mentioned it's foundational. And, well, from my own dives, I've seen agency principles constantly popping up in bar exam essays.
Oh, constantly.
You might think you're answering a question about partnerships or corporations, maybe, but the core issue being tested often boils down to agency. So this is definitely a doubly important topic for our listener to grasp. It really does underpin so much.
Absolutely. And to understand how this powerful relationship is formed,
Yeah.
we boil it down to what I like to call the ABCs of agency formation: assent, benefit, and control.
ABC.
These are the three non-negotiable requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Think of these three elements as like a diagnostic checklist. If even one is missing, you might not have a true agency relationship, which can dramatically change who is legally responsible for what.
So, assent, benefit, control. That sounds like a powerful checklist. Can you walk us through each of those? Because I imagine it's not always as simple as someone explicitly saying, you are now my agent.
Exactly. It's usually not that formal. Let's start with assent. Both parties, the principal and the agent, must manifest assent to the agency relationship. Now, this doesn't mean they have to use the word agency or even consciously know they are entering into a formal legal agency relationship.
Right. It's about their actions.
Precisely. The manifestation is key. It's about what their words or actions indicate to a reasonable person looking from the outside. It's an objective standard. For instance, if you ask a friend, hey, can you drop off this package for me? And they say, sure, and take the package. Well, their actions manifest assent. Even if you never said, you are now my agent for package delivery.
Okay, makes sense.
This implied assent is crucial because so many agency relationships are formed informally, not through big formal contracts. Next up is benefit. The agent must be acting for the principal's benefit. This aligns with the whole idea that the principal is delegating tasks or objectives to the agent. The agent isn't just, pursuing their own agenda. Their actions are intended to help the principal achieve some goal or perform some duty. It's about serving the principal's interests. Now, even if the agent also benefits, maybe they get paid, the primary thrust of their action, for defining the relationship anyway, must be for the principal.
Got it. So, assent, benefit, what's the C?
And finally, control. The agent's actions must be subject to the principal's control. Now, this control is specifically regarding the result or the ultimate objectives of the work. And some important cases we'll discuss the manner of performance, too. While the principal might not dictate every single step the agent takes.
They don't have to micromanage.
Right, exactly. But they retain the right to direct the overall outcome and the key decisions. For example, if I hire someone to build a deck, I control the design, the materials, the deadline, those ultimate objectives, even if I don't stand there supervising every hammer swing. It's the right to control, even if it's not fully exercised all the time, that really matters.
Yeah.
This is where courts often dig deep into the specific facts of a case.
That distinction between control over the result versus control over the manner of doing the work, that seems incredibly important. And for anyone analyzing a legal problem, especially for an exam like the bar, underscoring the importance of listing and analyzing these ABCs in any legal analysis, well, it can't be overstated, can it? The actual relationship isn't always explicitly stated by the parties involved, so showing that you can spot these implied elements is like your first diagnostic tool, your agency checklist.
It absolutely is. You have to establish the relationship first. Moving on, let's talk more about the principle, the guiding force in this relationship. Almost any person or entity with legal capacity can be a principal. This is a really broad category, and the type of principal often dictates the level of control and, crucially, the subsequent liability. We can sort of categorize principals in a few ways. An individual can be a principal pretty straightforwardly when they intend to delegate an act and control how another person performs that act, like you asking a friend to pick up your dry cleaning and giving them specific instructions. Yeah, simple. Then we have an employer. An employer is a specific type of principal who hires an employee to perform services and, crucially, controls or has the right to control the manner in which that employee performs their work.
That manner part again.
Yes, it's a really significant distinction. The more control a principal exerts over how the worker does their job, not just what they achieve, the more likely they are to be deemed an employer. There are several factors courts look at, things that indicate an employer-employee relationship. Does the principal exercise significant control over the worker's day-to-day activities? Setting hours, dictating methods, specific steps?
Right.
Do they supply the tools needed for the trade? Is the worker paid on a structured pay period, like weekly or biweekly, rather than just getting a lump sum per project? Is the worker's skill highly specialized, suggesting maybe a need for more direct supervision or training by the principal? And does the principal direct the work all the way to completion, perhaps stepping in frequently to guide or correct? Think of like a manager overseeing a team on a daily basis, giving very specific instructions. That's a mental image of high control. And lastly, a business itself can be a principal. This includes entrepreneurs, corporations, or partnerships. It's worth noting, especially for exam purposes, that sole proprietors, individuals running their own business, often show up as principals in agency and partnership questions. They are the individual, but their business acts as the principal to their agents or employees.
Okay, so we've covered the principal, the one who delegates. Now let's turn to the agent, the acting party. You mentioned employees earlier. Are there other types of agents, and how do they differ fundamentally?
Yes, absolutely. There are two primary types of agents you'll commonly encounter, and the distinction is critical. First, the employee, as we just discussed. They perform tasks under the employer's direct control and direction, especially regarding the manner of performance. High control. Second, and this is a huge point of confusion sometimes, is the independent contractor. Now, independent contractors are agents, let's be clear on that. They act on behalf of the principal for the principal's benefit. But they are not subject to the principal's control regarding the manner in which they perform the work. The principal controls the result for an independent contractor, what gets done, but not the how. That's the key difference.
So what does this all mean for that employee versus independent contractor debate? It feels like it's everywhere these days, especially with the gig economy. It feels like that distinction is really important beyond just the strict legal definition. What are the practical implications?
Oh, it's incredibly important, both legally and practically. This distinction is really at the heart of so many lawsuits, tax issues, even labor disputes. It determines things like benefits, taxes, and liability. Let's elaborate on those differentiating factors again. For an employee, you typically see that high level of employer control over daily activities, structured pay periods, salary, hourly wage. The employee often works primarily, if not exclusively, for that one employer, and the employer usually provides the necessary tools. Think of, say, a full-time software engineer at a tech company. They likely have set hours, use a company laptop, and are directed on how to code certain features. That's an employee. An independent contractor, on the other hand, exhibits a high level of independence. They're often paid a fixed fee based on achieving a specific result, not based on the hours they put in. They're generally free to work for multiple clients or principals simultaneously. They manage their own schedules, and critically, they typically provide their own tools and equipment. For instance, a freelance graphic designer you hire to create a logo for your company. You tell them what you want the logo to look like, the end result. but you don't usually dictate which software they use, what hours they work, or if they're also designing logos for 5 other companies.
Right.
And this distinction has huge real-world implications. It affects everything from tax obligations, W-2 versus 1099, eligibility for benefits like health insurance and retirement plans, to, as we'll get into soon, the principal's liability for the agents towards their wrongful acts. It's a line that courts are constantly grappling with, especially as work arrangements evolve.
That really clarifies it, especially highlighting the real-world impact. Now, let's talk about forming the agency relationship itself. You mentioned the ABCs. What are the bare legal requirements to actually set one up? And just as important, maybe, what isn't required? Because I know there are some common misconceptions floating around.
Excellent question, because this is another area where people, especially students, can get tripped up. First, let's talk capacity. The principal must have the legal capacity to consent both to the agency relationship itself and to the specific transaction the agent aims to bind them to. So the principal generally needs to be of sound mind and legal age. However, here's a crucial insight, often tested. The agent only needs the physical and mental capability to perform the appointed task. They don't necessarily need full contractual capacity themselves.
Wait, so what does that mean practically?
It leads to a fascinating point. Minors and those legally deemed incompetent generally cannot be principals because they lack a capacity to authorize actions.
Right?
That could be agents. Yes. They have the capability to perform actions, even if they lack the full legal capacity to bind themselves to contracts. So a teenager could run an errand for an adult principal, acting as their agent for that task. But that adult couldn't authorize the teenager to, say, enter into a major real estate deal on their behalf if the teenager couldn't legally do so for themselves. One more point on capacity. Unincorporated associations, like informal clubs or groups without a formal legal structure, like a corporation, generally lack the capacity to act as principals. Second requirement, consent. Both the principal and the agent must consent to the agency relationship. As we mentioned with assent, this doesn't need to be explicit or written down. The agent can show their consent simply by performing the acts the principal requested. It's also generally a fluid relationship. Either party can unilaterally terminate the agency relationship at pretty much any time unless there's a specific contract stating otherwise, or what's called a power coupled with an interest involved, which we can touch on later. This highlights that agency is often at will. Third, and this is truly counterintuitive for many people new to this area of law, consideration is not required.
No payment needed.
Nope. Agency relationships can be created without any payment or exchange of value-changing hands. You can have what's called a gratuitous agent, like a friend who agrees to pick up your mail while you're on vacation or buys groceries for you because you're sick. No money changes hands, but a legally binding agency relationship can still exist, carrying all the associated duties and potential liabilities. This is where many get surprised that simple favor for a friend can actually carry real legal weight. Finally, writing is generally not necessary to create an agency relationship.
So verbal agreements are usually enough.
Yes, absolutely. This means many agency relationships are formed informally, based just on spoken words or even just the actions and implied consent of the parties. Now, there are exceptions. Some specific transactions might require a writing due to other laws, like the statute of frauds often requires an agent's authority to sell real estate to be in writing. But the agency relationship itself usually doesn't need a formal written contract. This is why courts spend so much time looking at the conduct, the ABCs, rather than always demanding a written document. Okay, so now that we've established how an agency relationship gets created, let's talk about the really significant stakes involved. This is where it gets serious. Once that relationship exists, the principal can potentially be bound to contracts entered into by the agent. And crucially, they can be subject to vicarious liability for the agent's torts, their wrongful acts.
Right. This is where the legal consequences really hit home. This is where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? I can clearly see the typical agency fact pattern on an exam now. First, they describe some situation that arguably forms an agency relationship using those ABCs. Then the agent does something, maybe signs a contract or crashes the company van while supposedly working, and then boom, a third party sues the principal. So it really boils down to, is the principal on the hook for what the agent did? That's the core question, right?
Exactly. That's almost always the central issue. Let's start with contractual liability of the principal. When is the principal bound by a contract the agent made? A principal is bound if the agent had actual authority or the agent had apparent authority, or if the principal later ratified the act, or in some rarer cases, if the principal is stopped from denying the authority. These are basically the four main pathways to holding the principal liable on that contract. When you're analyzing a problem, you're essentially checking for these four possibilities.
Hmm.
And when you're trying to figure out the type of authority, actual versus apparent, always look at the communication. This is a key differentiator, almost like a secret decoder ring for authority questions.
Okay, what's the code?
It's this. If the principal communicates with the agent, and that communication leads the agent to reasonably believe they can act, that's potentially actual authority. The agent's belief is paramount here. If the principal communicates something to a third party that makes the third party reasonably believe the agent has authority, that's apparent authority. Here, the third party's reasonable belief is what matters. This distinction is absolutely fundamental. So always ask yourself, who is the principal communicating with? The agent or the third party?
Got it. Agent communication for actual, third-party communication for apparent.
There you-
Okay, so let's dig into actual authority. Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. What does actual authority truly mean? What makes an agent actually authorized? Sounds straightforward, but I bet it has its nuances.
It definitely does. Actual authority stems from a manifestation of the principal's intent to the agent. This manifestation causes the agent to reasonably believe, that's the objective part. Would a reasonable person in the agent's shoes believe this? That they're doing what the principal wants them to do, that's the subjective part, the agent's actual belief. It's all about the principal's direct communication to the agent and how the agent interprets that. It's like the agent's internal compass, guiding their actions based on what they genuinely believe the principal desires. We can break actual authority down into two main types. First, there's express actual authority. This is created by the principal's oral or written words, usually clear, direct, definite language, or specific detailed terms and instructions. Think of a principal telling their agent, go buy me 500 widgets, but don't spend more than $5 per widget. That's a clear, express directive. And importantly, the principal generally needs to give clear notice if they disagree with how the agent is interpreting their authority. Silence or inaction in the face of known actions by the agent can sometimes be seen as affirming the agent's belief in their authority. Second, and often trickier, is implied actual authority. This isn't based on explicit words, but rather on what an agent reasonably believes is necessary, usual, and proper to accomplish the principal's stated objectives. It's the authority that's understood to be part of the job or the situation, even if no one spelled it out.
So how does that arise? Where does this implied understanding come from?
There are several common sources. One is custom. Absent specific instructions to the contrary, an agent generally has implied authority to act within accepted business customs or general trade usage within a particular industry or locality. For example, a general manager of a retail store usually has implied authority to hire staff, order inventory, and handle day-to-day operations, because those are customary actions for that role, even if their employment contract doesn't list every single possible task. Another source is the agent's position. Just placing an agent in a specific position of authority, like making someone vice president of sales or treasurer, can manifest the principal's assent to the agent performing the actions that are customary for that position. If you hire someone as a regional sales director, they impliedly have the authority to do what regional sales directors typically do, like negotiating sales contracts within certain parameters or managing a regional sales team without you needing to explicitly authorize each individual negotiation or management decision. And then there's acquiescence. This is really important. Implied authority can arise from the principal's acceptance of the agent's past acts, or maybe even more significantly, the principal's failure to object to unauthorized actions the agent took previously. This inaction can affirm the agent's belief about what the principal wants and support the agent's perception that they have authority to act similarly in the future. Imagine your administrative assistant, without explicit permission, starts ordering office supplies from a new, cheaper vendor. If you see the invoices, use the supplies, know about it, and never say, hey, don't do that, your acquiescence could imply they now have the authority to continue ordering from that vendor. A quick but important note on delegation. Generally, an agent cannot delegate their own express or implied authority to some other third party without the principal's express permission. The idea is that the principal chose that specific agent for their skills and trustworthiness, so the agent can't just hand off their responsibilities unless the principal explicitly says it's okay. Okay, so that's actual authority, both express and implied, focusing on the agent's belief. Now let's shift gears to apparent authority. This is distinct because it's all about what the third party reasonably believes based on the principal's actions. Remember, actual authority is about the agent's belief based on principal-to-agent communication.
Right.
Apparent authority is created by words or conduct by the principal that cause a third party to reasonably believe the agent has authority to act on the principal's behalf. The focus here is entirely on the principal's manifestations to the outside world, not their private instructions to the agent. The key question is, did the principal somehow hold out this person as their agent, leading the third party to rely on that appearance?
So what kind of conduct counts as holding out? What creates that appearance?
It could be several things. It could be based on past dealings between the principal and the agent that the third party was aware of. For instance, if your company's regular supplier has always dealt with your purchasing manager, Jane, to place orders, they'd reasonably assume Jane still has authority to place orders next week, even if you secretly transferred her yesterday without telling the supplier. The principal hasn't corrected the supplier's reasonable belief. It could also stem from established trade customs for similar transactions, or relevant industry standards that a third party would normally expect an agent in that role to adhere to. Even the principal's written statements of authority, maybe like a letter of introduction or job title given to the agent, but which the agent then shows to a third party, can create apparent authority. For example, if a principal gives their sales agent business cards stating Regional Sales Director and allows them to sign routine contracts on company letterhead, that creates apparent authority in the eyes of a customer for that agent to enter into typical sales contracts. And just like with implied actual authority arising from position, appointing an agent to a specific role like general manager or vice president manifests to the public that the agent possesses the customary level of authority for that position. A third party dealing with someone introduced as the store manager reasonably believes that person has the authority to handle typical store operations, like accepting returns or handling customer complaints, because that's what the principal's act of appointing them suggests to the world. Now, authority, whether actual or apparent, doesn't last forever, of course. Termination of authority is crucial because it determines if a principal is still bound by later actions. Authority can end in several ways. The most straightforward is revocation by the principal or renunciation by the agent. Basically, one party tells the other, we're done. This is effective as soon as the other party receives notice.
So just telling them is enough.
Generally, yes. There's an important exception, though. Authority cannot be revoked if the agent's power is coupled with an interest in the subject matter of the agency. This is a bit technical, but it basically means the agent has a property interest or a security interest tied to the authority, for instance. If the agent lent money to the principal and the authority to sell something was given as security for that loan, in that case, the principal can't just revoke it. Authority also terminates if the agency agreement itself specifies an end date or condition. Maybe the contract says this agency relationship lasts for 1 year or it ends upon completion of the project. Then when that happens, authority ends. Changed circumstances can also terminate authority, sometimes automatically. If a really significant change occurs, like a change in law making the agency's purpose illegal, the principal or agent becoming insolvent, a dramatic shift in market conditions making the task pointless, the destruction of the specific subject matter of the agency, like the house to be sold burns down, or a major disaster. And that change would cause a reasonable agent to believe the principal would no longer consent to them acting. Then actual authority terminates.
Okay, that makes sense. What about death? That seems pretty final.
Yes, death is a big one and a common exam topic. For the death of the principal, the modern trend, and the one usually tested on the bar, is that the agent's actual authority terminates when the agent receives notice of the principal's death. Not necessarily at the moment of death itself.
But apparent authority might linger.
Exactly.
Right.
Apparent authority might persist until the third party also receives notice. This protects third parties who didn't know the principal died. However, the death of the agent terminates the agent's actual authority automatically and immediately. No notice required there. The specific person chosen is gone. And finally, authority can terminate if required by statute, or critically, if the agent breaches one of their fiduciary duties to the principal, like the duty of loyalty. If the agent starts acting against the principal's interest, their authority to act for the principal is logically terminated.
Okay, so we have actual authority, apparent authority, and ways they can end. But what about ratification? You mentioned that earlier. This is when a principal signs off on something after it's already happened, right? Maybe an act that wasn't authorized originally. This sounds like a way for a principal to maybe salvage a deal they initially didn't greenlight.
That's exactly what ratification is. It's a crucial concept, essentially an after-the-fact approval or affirmation by the principal. A principal can choose to ratify an act that was performed by someone else purportedly on their behalf, even if that person wasn't actually their agent at the time, or if an actual agent exceeded their authority. By ratifying, the principal is essentially saying, okay, I didn't authorize that action back then, but now that I know about it and see the outcome, I approve of it. I'll accept the benefits and the burdens as if I had authorized it from the very beginning.
Mhm.
When ratification occurs, it relates back, it has the same legal effect as if the act was properly authorized from the moment it happened.
So, what does the principal need to do for it to count as ratification? Are there specific requirements?
Yes, there are 4 key requirements for a valid ratification that you absolutely must check for in any analysis. Get these down. First, the principal must ratify the entire act or transaction. They can't cherry pick, they can't accept the beneficial parts of the deal and reject the obligations. It's an all or nothing proposition. Second, both the principal and the third party involved must have had the legal capacity to enter into the transaction, both when the act originally occurred and at the time of the ratification. For instance, if the principal was legally incompetent when the agent acted, they couldn't validly ratify it until they regained competency. Third, the principal's ratification must be timely. This generally means it has to happen before the third party withdraws from the transaction or before circumstances have changed so fundamentally that it would be unfair or inequitable to bind the third party to the deal. You can't wait weeks to see if the stock price goes up before deciding to ratify the unauthorized purchase. And finally, and this is critical, the principal must have knowledge of all the material facts involved in the original act at the time they ratify.
You can't ratify something if you don't fully understand what you're agreeing to. Willful ignorance isn't enough. You need actual or constructive knowledge of the important details. And just one important reminder here. Regardless of whether the principal is ultimately liable on the contract through actual authority, apparent authority, or ratification, the agent might also be liable to the third party. We'll get to the agent's own liability in a moment, but it's critical to remember the principal being on the hook doesn't automatically let the agent off. Okay, now let's shift from contracts to torts. The principal's liability to third parties in tort for the agent's conduct. This is where we encounter vicarious liability and direct liability. This is often where